Hello, this is lecture 2, Sociological Theories. I promise the audio will be better than it was on perhaps another lecture that you might encounter that's already done, but I haven't technically reached that point in the class yet. Never mind all that. So we're going to talk about theories of society. What is a theory? Basically, theory is a formal statement of an idea about something, the origin of something, the operation of something, the end result of a series of events interacting. It can be a number of things, but basically it's just an idea about the world. And it's expressed in some sort of formal language, either with greater or lesser degrees of mathematical predictability and so forth. So basically, sociological theories, of course, are about social behavior, the behavior of humans in groups, and the factors which influence that behavior, how that behavior has changed over time, the nature of institutions, the nature of social class and discrimination, and how the economy has changed over time. Multiple topics can be addressed abstractly through sociological theory, and these abstractions can be operationalized in a way that allows people to do research to test those theories. So we'll talk much more about operationalizing ideas in testing theory in the next lecture, lecture 3. For now, let's just go back a ways to the beginning of sociology and perhaps even further back. I'm going to share my screen now, so you may follow along in the presentation, of which there is a PDF in Canvas. Okay, you should be seeing my screen now. Zoom tells me you are seeing it. So let me make sure I'm still recording. Yes, still recording. Okay. This is mostly for my face-to-face classes that I've decorated the title slide here. These are photos of humans in groups. Small group here. These folks, I believe, are protesting for a specific length of the working day, if I remember correctly. This is a parade of children in North Korea, which seems to be highly ritualized. They seem to be playing certain roles there, not in a real sense, but in an imagined sense. Here we have a scene from the Industrial Revolution. A woman and a child work in a textile mill in England during the early 19th century. Most workers in textile mills were children, and there were typically more women than men as well in the mill. I believe there's a third person there. Children didn't have to be paid very much, and also they had small fingers that could get into the nooks and crannies of this machinery to remove jammed bits of cotton or whatever. Of course, many were also injured seriously as a result, but there were no child labor laws to protect them. And when the first child labor laws in Britain were enacted, they were pretty generous to employers. This was in the 1830s. You could not employ a child to work in a mine, and they could not work more than 10 hours a day in any particular, in a textile mill, for instance. So here we have an Italian-American Columbus Day parade. Columbus Day, of course, is a contentious holiday. Christopher Columbus is someone the Italians are much prouder of than for instance, the Native Americans in this hemisphere. So, moving on. A brief history, very brief. Sociology as such didn't really exist before what we can now call the Enlightenment, a period in the late 17th, early 18th century when certain scholars, basically men of leisure, because there were few professional jobs for writers and thinkers in those days. These were typically almost always men. Some women were involved in the movement, but few. These were men who were independently wealthy generally and could spend time thinking about the nature of society and history and so forth. So the movement was centered in Europe, but it influenced several other people who were instrumental in declaring our independence from Britain, like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. But the big names in the Enlightenment were French. Voltaire and Denis Diderot were two that were important. Diderot compiled an encyclopedia attempting to systematize human knowledge. One thing which they advocated was ending the habit of accepting ideas simply because they had always been accepted. They encouraged questioning received wisdom and using one's reason to understand something in the world rather than simply looking up the answer in a book that was considered the authority. In that era, the authority on all things scientific, for the most part, was Aristotle, a Greek philosopher who had been dead since about the year 300 BCE. However, he became for a variety of reasons, he was a philosopher, but he did do some sorts of scientific work, some limited observation. Few other Greek philosophers did any actual observation, although they're credited with creating the scientific spirit, so to speak. Not the modern scientific approach we have, of course, but just developing the idea that the world could be understood by making observations of things that went on in the world, and it might not have anything to do with the gods, Zeus and Hera and Athena, Apollo, and the other members of the Greek pantheon. Things might have a material basis and not a divine origin. We might be more than simply playthings of the gods. So they didn't do it that much formal research, though. They talked about the notion of doing observation and explaining things through the use of reason. And they did apply reason to a number of philosophical questions. You've probably heard of Socrates and Plato. Socrates, for instance, was more interested in how to live a just life and what exactly is justice, what is the good, how do we know when something is true and when it is not. They didn't focus on science. In the Enlightenment, science began to become more of a thing, so to speak. It was not, it had been more or less formally defined prior to the Enlightenment, but it became sort of the model on which one should proceed in the future in understanding the world. They thought that the Enlightenment thinkers tend to see the universe as a mechanism, a machine that was set in motion perhaps by a creator perhaps, but then was off on its own. It just continued to operate. Many of the Enlightenment thinkers, including Thomas Jefferson, were what are called deists. They believed in a divine presence, a creator, but not necessarily the same thing as the God of Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. Now, social theory, and you will notice this as I go through, has a Eurocentric bias. It tends to be These tend to be European white males that I'm talking about. But there were others who treated social issues that were not European white males. So the early Greeks and Romans, not pre-modern, for instance, they didn't really, whatever they did, which could be applicable to sociology, whatever ideas they had, were more about politics. So, but politics involves human behavior, of course, and it's the struggle for power by human actors. So it's relevant. But there was a Chinese historian, Ma Tuanlin, who lived in the late 13th, early 14th century CE, who wrote The General Study of Literary Remains, where he discussed the social causes of historical change. Also, a Tunisian philosopher, Ibn Khaldun, who he wasn't a philosopher per se, he was more of a theologian. And he wrote social theory in a theological context. He wrote about the dynamic dynamic relationship between the settled people in the towns and the Bedouins, the nomadic cultures that were found in North Africa, the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula. He saw a cycling of power between the two over time. His work has only recently been noted, partly because he did it in the context of interpretations of the Quran and Islamic law. So anyway, he worked in the late 14th century CE. There are many others as well. I think I may have mentioned this idea in the European Middle Ages, and this is relevant to this course because, as I said, most of these early social theorists are European. This would have been part of their stock of knowledge. The idea of the great chain of being, which was widely believed in Europe for nearly 1,000 years. This idea was the structure of society was established by God in the beginning. Everyone was assigned to a particular place within this order, and monks and clerics actually compiled lists ordering every type of person and thing. This chain ran from God all the way down to the smallest insect. And every being was part of it. It even went into the family unit. So you could find documentation allegedly of divine origin, which stated that within the family, the oldest male, the husband, for want of a better word, was higher on this chain than his wife, the mother of his children. And then it went to the oldest male child, who was higher than in the chain in importance in God's sight than the other male children. And then the next, after the youngest male child, you had the oldest female child. So we have this sexual hierarchy, of inequality from the Middle Ages and earlier, of course. Anyway, the great chain of being was believed to be just the way the world was, and you had to accept it. If you wanted to improve your station, to move to a higher class, for instance, because classes were ranked as well beyond the household, that could be seen by some as rebelling against the order established by God, and that was not a healthy thing to do in Europe of the Middle Ages. Many ideas that Europeans held as reflecting the world as it always had been and would always be were shaken when first Columbus and later Magellan, Magellan, Cortez, and others began to sail west from Europe, initially under the belief that they could sail straight to India. They were engaged in trade with India and China. at that point, and it was overland routes. For instance, something called the Silk Road, which there are still remnants of it. Some historic cities like Samarkand, very beautiful cities in Uzbekistan, I believe, um, were key nodes on this trade route known as the Silk Road. Um, if you follow the news, you may know China is trying to develop sort of a new Silk Road. It's called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially a trading route between China and Europe, Africa, so forth. Anyway, so these Europeans were sailing Columbus the First. He thought he'd reached the Indies, he'd reached the Western Hemisphere, and rather than finding, he thought he'd reached India, rather. He named the area, he recalled the area he arrived at, the Indies. He thought they were islands just off the coast of India proper, perhaps. But it was the Western Hemisphere. He was in the Caribbean, in what is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic initially. So he pretty quickly realized that the people there were not Indian, and they lived they lived completely differently than anyone he'd ever heard of, or definitely than any European. They had not heard of any of the major religions. He noted that they were very peaceful and very very peaceable, not hostile at all, just curious and innocent. He noticed they gave one of them he presented one with or a group of them with a sword. They didn't know what a sword was and cut themselves accidentally. And he made a note that these people would make good servants, and that if he came back with 50 armed men, they could probably dominate all of them and make them do whatever they wanted. So many of them did become servants, but many more died from diseases the Europeans brought with them, for which the indigenous and Native Americans is kind of a misnomer, because we all came from Africa. So nobody's native to the Western Hemisphere. Often the term used now is first peoples. They were the first people to settle that area, to live in that area. So I will try to pivot to that whenever necessary. If I don't, just remember that first peoples is really the appropriate way to describe Native Americans. So anyway, so the faith they had that God's will was operative in the entire world, with a few notable exceptions, was certainly shaken. So that was one shock that to the age-old beliefs. Adam Smith was another Enlightenment figure, the Scottish Enlightenment. He wrote the book Wealth of Nations, which is sort of a founding document of the capitalist system. But he also wrote about moral philosophy and social behavior in general, began to generalize, make general claims about how humans acted in groups, particularly in the economic realm. A French philosopher, Montesquieu, also associated with the Enlightenment, but not quite as heavy hitter. He wasn't a heavy hitter like Voltaire, although perhaps pretty important. Wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws. And Montesquieu lived mostly in the early 18th century. So, and in The Spirit of the Laws, among other things, he tried to explain cultural differences on the basis of geography and climate. So Montesquieu was actually, for what it's worth, that was more or less shorthand. That was not his nickname per se, but it was certainly easier than referring to him as Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de la Breda et de Montesquieu. So I guess it's his last name. He was the Baron of Montesquieu. But my French is non-existent. So Auguste Comte, he gets credit for applying the term sociology to this field of study that you have enrolled in, to study in, or that you will study in the class you enrolled in. It was first used by Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, a cleric, a priest. Comte wanted to use the term social physics, but someone else had already claimed that and had put it into print. So he appropriated sociology. I don't know that he knew that the Abbot Sieyès had already applied it to something. But anyway, that is history now. So Comte thought that one could use scientific methods to study social behavior and thereby be able to understand and predict what particular interventions in human affairs, what consequences those would have. Being able to predict, just as one could predict if you mix silver and chlorine in a particular proportions, you will get a certain amount of silver chloride. He believed you could find general laws of human social behavior, and once you knew how to manipulate human social behavior with specific intervention, you could eliminate all social problems, make the world a better place. Comte had developed a theory of stages, which put sociology at the top, at the pinnacle of this evolutionary schema he developed. So society had passed through 3 stages, and these stages, of course, are reflected in their understanding of how the world works. The theological stage, where you explain events and the origin of the world in terms of the supernatural, usually gods, but it could be in other traditions, demons or fairies were out there that you might appeal to for some favor. Then in the metaphysical stage, which I haven't totally grasped, it's a bit more abstract than the theological stage, and the supernatural entities certainly are more abstract. But it's perhaps similar to Hegel's theory of history and existence, which I'll touch on briefly when we get to Marx. Finally, European society, entered the phase he called the positive stage, which he believed he was one of the first to point out, and a fine example of a thinker active in the positive stage, where scientific methods are used to understand the world, and they're applied to changing the world. And scientists, people engaged in this, work to uncover these predictive laws. They're not so concerned with causes. They just want to be able to relate a certain set of initial conditions by way of a theory, usually with a mathematical form, to particular consequences. So in a sense, today we would say that they would be concerned with causes. These initial conditions, might as well call them causes. Philosophers of science argue about that sort of thing constantly, so we'll just leave that. But this positive method is the root of the term positivism. Positivism is the belief that you can only understand the world through using scientific methods, no other way. So positivism is a variant of something I'll talk about in the next lecture called empiricism, which is basically just making observations of the world, drawing conclusions, and using these observations as the basis for explaining what's going on, rather than sitting in an armchair using abstract logic or looking it up in Aristotle's writings or a holy book of some sort. So Comte really didn't contribute much to the field he's sometimes is credited with founding. After this theory of stages, he thought humanity needed a new universal religion, and so he developed the outlines of a moral code and a set of beliefs for this universal religion of humanity. And he named himself the Pope of this church of universal love. And his writings got a little strange after that, so we will leave Comte at this point. But just remember, if you have an exam and you have to say who was the person that applied the term sociology to the study of you, who came up with that word, Compt is the answer. Okay, because Abbott CAs applied it to something slightly different. COMTE, Auguste Comte. Okay, taxonomy is just classification. I don't know why I use that word, but at least I put its meaning there. So there's three broad categories in general the sociologists recognize. They're conflict theories, structural functional theories, and symbolic actionist or micro-interactionist theories. You don't have to swear allegiance to one particular theory, group, or another. You can mix and match. You can use whatever theoretical understanding fits your research problem, whatever it is you're trying to understand. Because, and really, the symbolic interactionists are, if you are teaching, for instance, if you're writing a textbook of general sociology, the broad range, and you are heavily invested in conflict theory, you're still going to have to draw upon the symbolic interactionists, because conflict theorists generally have nothing to say about small group dynamics, about socialization and social interaction. The symbolic interactionists and other micro-interactionists have that territory. Same goes for the structural functionalists, although they go a little further down the chain from this big picture, macro level analysis than the conflict theorists, perhaps. I'm probably oversimplifying. And frankly, I can't keep up to the extent I would like to with trends in sociological theory. Personally, my orientation is towards conflict theories and particular variants therein. So that's mostly what I know about and keep up with. All right. Sociology arose as an attempt to try to understand a couple of big events that had led to a state of being, a situation which they called modernity. Modernity is this era, that sounds much, the meaning is much like it sounds. You have left the past ways of doing things. Now, sometimes you'll see in history classes, history divided into ancient, medieval, the Middle Ages, and the modern era. That division, I believe, was made by an Italian writer of the Renaissance era known as Petrarch. And Petrarch believed he was in the modern era. Today, we would call that the early modern, I think, because it's definitely the period of modernity as used by sociologists refers to the period after, beginning with and after the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. So really late 18th century we're talking about. The French Revolution took place in 1789. The Industrial Revolution began in England in the late 18th century, let's say 1770, and continued into the mid-19th century in a big way when it began spreading to the rest of Europe. A lot of the work that was done, the initial breakthroughs had been made by, say, 1850. So this new era of modernity was much different than everything that had gone before. Before that, in the era which I mentioned, the Middle Ages, the social formation which people tended to which believed people lived under in the Middle Ages was something called feudalism, where people were connected by chains of mutual obligation. If you know a little bit about European history, or you've paid much attention to a lot of popular culture, particularly films about King Arthur, or even on Netflix, one called Kingdom, which goes back to the very early Middle Ages in England, you'll be aware there were kings, and and other aristocrats who had um, retainers that would fight for them if need be. Um, Typically, these obligations were cemented by the exchange of the right to use land for the right to for the requirement to provide military service. You go far enough down the feudal ladder where you get to, for instance, the knights, who are the military elite. They're supported by peasants who work some land that the knight controls, but the peasant is allowed to live on and grow food on, and in exchange for giving a portion of that food to the knight, or the often it is they're a knight, but they may be considered a lord of some sort, a lord over the peasants. They are the judge for all that goes on in their domain, so to speak, which has been given to them by someone higher up the chain than them, etc., etc. And the peasants really, they um, adapted to this life, although many of them were bound to the soil. They could not, they were serfs. The word serf comes from servius, which is the Latin word for slave. They weren't exactly slaves, but they weren't quite free either. If, as was the case, as feudalism began to give way to capitalism, they might become aware of opportunities in one of the free cities. There were cities which were chartered by the king, by someone higher up the feudal scale. These cities were given a charter that allowed them to freely do their thing. People lived there. They were not, they might owe some form of taxes to a king, but they did not owe food directly, and they definitely did not owe another thing which the serfs and peasants owed their lord, which would be labor services. What was common was maybe 2 days a week you did whatever kind of labor your lord uh, required you to do, in addition to your farming. So now, what did the peasants get out of this? They got a place to live, they had a place to grow their food, and the Lord did have obligations to them. As I said, people were bound by mutual obligation. Um, if a peasant got sick, the Lord would make sure they got whatever attention could be given in that era. And, I'm talking like the year 1300, 1400 at the latest. Um, they would make sure that the peasant and his family had enough food. They wouldn't be allowed to starve. If the peasant's ox died, he needed the ox to pull the plow. The Lord was obligated to provide him with another ox to do. That was just part of the way it went. If they were attacked by an army of another aristocrat, or invaders from the east, some of the nomadic tribes of Central Asia, for instance, periodically rode in and took what they could, and just generally caused a lot of trouble. The Lord was responsible for protecting the peasants as well by mobilizing those military personnel who had benefited from some other largesse of the Lord, because the Lord might have other lands to give away. That was typically the case, that an powerful aristocrat of some sort, or lord, whatever you want to call them, a knight, um, they typically had other lands which were not connected to those on which they had their home, which towards the later Middle Ages became what we call a castle. So, but the peasants were kind of comfortable when feudalism fell and suddenly wage labor replaced the serf lord relationship, and the land on which they'd lived and grown food became something they had to pay rent for. There a number of uncertainties and insecurities were introduced into their life that they had not faced. They were on their own. There was no one above them who would make sure they were fed if they were sick, or would provide them an ox if theirs died, and so forth. they lost a lot of security, and the world began to change quite rapidly. This rapidity increased with the Industrial Revolution, when you began to see the development of large factories where economic activities, production took place, typically a lot of production for the market in the period where feudalism was giving rise to capitalism, but just short of the Industrial Revolution. This work was done at home with the family. Whoever was going to be selling, for instance, clothing on the market, if your family's making particular kind of clothing, they're weaving textiles into cloth and cutting that and making some clothing. They would provide for some of the raw materials, and not the family. There would be someone who would provide the raw materials and then come back and get the finished product and take it to market. So you would kind of set your own hours. I guess you might call it the early gig economy of sorts, but it turned out to be just as unstable as some people are finding the contemporary gig economy to be. Eventually, you tended to see people moving into the cities to work in factories to sell their labor to the owners of the factories. Additionally, the French Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution and the end of feudalism, partly the end of feudalism was, we'll talk about that dynamic a little later, but that happened as well somewhat earlier. But the Industrial Revolution had changed how people made their livings, how they stayed alive, how they met their basic needs in the world. They tended not to make everything at home. Suddenly, some things were being manufactured in large factories, and you would purchase them on markets using money you were given as a wage for the work you did for an employer, for a capitalist that owned a factory or a mine or something of that nature. So, and our relationship to power was further changed by the French Revolution, when Louis XVI, the King of France, whose family had controlled France since the year shortly before the year 900. Since that time, when Hugh Capet became King of France, his descendants had become kings of France. And this was considered, again, a divinely ordained, means set up and blessed by a god system. It was believed that kings had a divine right to command humans to do their bidding and to prevent them from doing other things, to forbid and to command. So this new era where, the French Revolution, king was overthrown, and you had a national democracy of sorts in France. People became citizens. They were no longer subjects of the king. They were citizens of a republic. Not everyone was a citizen. Women were not citizens in the sense that they had any say in in running the government. They did not have the vote. Not even all men had the vote. There were property qualifications initially. France was one of the last countries to grant women the right to vote in elections. This didn't happen until 1945, I believe, or maybe a year or two later. We'll talk about that later. So modernity is this phase where suddenly the world's been turned upside down. There's no more kings, and the security of this relationship with someone above you had in the feudal era, that is gone. You are on your own. You're in a crowded, dirty, smelly, unhealthy city, working long hours in a dimly lit, dangerous factory rather than out in the fresh air, growing food and doing whatever. So this era is what sociologists refer to as modernity. Okay, I think I said that. In the Communist Manifesto, which was a work intended to inspire a revolution written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, a lot of it, though, may have been written by Karl Marx's wife, Jenny Marx. There's a debate about that. Some of it definitely was. They found notes that showed her changes as she was proofreading and editing his work. Marx had notoriously horrible handwriting, so she had to rewrite everything before submitting for publication. This is an excellent, it's widely cited passage to describe this transition, particularly this phrase, all that is solid melts into the air, all that is holy is profane, and is less compelled to face with sober senses as real conditions of life. Now remember, before in this era and really into the 20th century, people said man when they really meant humans. So feminists have noted this, and you may have noticed that too. It seems a little archaic. Well, it is archaic. This was written in 1848. As we'll see in a moment, the revolutions of 1848, which he'd hoped to inspire, actually took place without his input. This was very few people read this. It was published in multiple languages, but it was not a bestseller by any means, the Communist Manifesto. So, okay, conflict theory is the first theory group we'll talk about. Conflict theories, there's a lot of diversity, but one thing which unites them and in common is that idea that inequality characterizes all social systems. And this inequality creates conflict, usually between those who control resources, either material resources like land, jobs, food, money, and symbolic resources like the right to vote or the right to an education. It's with the conflicts between those who control it and those who do not and would like to access it. Inequality is systematically produced through the normal operation of social institutions, processes. It's not an aberration. It is automatically created. And the problem of order is something which sociologists used to be very concerned with. In other words, why does society hang together at all? Why is there such a thing? Why are we not just independent agents following our own self-interest, as some economists would say we are doing? Well, most people have their answer as to what holds society together. For the conflict theorists, it's held together by force, coercion. Coercion is if you coerce someone to do something, you are using some mechanism to force them to do it, whether they want to or not. It could involve physical force, the threat of violence, but it can involve a sort of a mental coercion, the acceptance of the ideology of those in charge, the dominant group, an ideology which acts in the interests of the dominant group and disadvantages the subordinate groups. So, but this ideology, this set of beliefs that normalizes the world, that makes it seem natural, that it can involve falsehoods, but does not necessarily have to be completely false. It's transmitted to the subordinate classes through cultural institutions, at least according to Gramsci for the most part, but like the church, the educational system, even the family as well. You're taught how the world works and what the rules are, what's right and wrong, what is your role in the world, what can you expect, what can you not, what are the limitations set by the existing order on what you're going to do with your life. Ideology. So it can be coercive. Anyway, also the conflict is normal. It doesn't mean that society is breaking down. It could be part of the transition to a new type of society. Again, going back to a quote from Marx, I believe this was from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, which was about French politics, about Louis Napoleon's seizure of power in 1849 in France, I believe, 1850. That force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. So conflict theorists also think that material interests, meaning in their view primarily economic interests, are more important than norms and values, than ideas, what people think is important, in explaining why society operates as it does and why it changes over time. Okay, Karl Marx is, you can basically call him the founder of conflict theory. I'm not sure he knew that's what he was doing. I doubt it. Marx considered himself a scientist. He was trying to understand what he called it, the laws of motion of capitalist society. He's modeling that statement on Isaac Newton's laws of physics and laws of motion, which set a standard for what scientific explanations should be. He wanted to dedicate his major work, Das Kapital, or Capital, to Charles Darwin. Darwin politely declined the honor. But what's important, one of the important things about Marx's ideas, he was the first person to suggest that social class might be a determining factor in social change, or that it had anything at all to do with how societies operated. People recognized there were different classes, but they tended to link it to either the great chain of being or with some other theory that basically said, an ideology which said this is how the world is. People are just naturally sorted into these groupings on the basis of an ability given to them by God, whatever it might be. Later you'll come across some other formulations of those ideas. So after Marx was a political activist, a journalist, as well as a philosopher who studied economics. He was influenced heavily by a philosopher, a German philosopher, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. It's very difficult to read. Hegel had a overarching theory of history that, rather, it was not linked to social classes. It was not even particularly driven by humans. It was driven by spirit, by an idea of sorts. The idea could be, some people have seen it as God, other people have seen it as an abstraction. Marx was, as I say, influenced by Hegel, but he was a member of a group called the Young Hegelians that kind of transmuted Hegel's writings. Marx felt he took Hegel and turned him right side up. He thought Hegel had things backwards, but he just needed to rotate it 180 degrees. So I'm not going to go into the details of all that, but suffice it to say that Hegel believed that there was a theory of history that history moved in a predictable, systematic way, and Marx adopted that notion. His causal agents and the endpoints were different than those Hegel had assigned, but he thought he was explicating the actual laws of history. So here's a brief biography of Marx. I think it should have, let's see if this is going to work. Just gotta drag this over here, I'll bet. And let's see, should have my ad block. How about that? Who would have known this had fun? Right. Let's see if we have the link now. Oh. Well, sometimes this does not work. Let me reload the page as a whole. I think we're going to get it. Yes, here we go.
To the outside world,
In a commercial. Didn't have that last time.
With polycythemia vera, PV, symptoms can change so slowly over time, you might not notice. But new or changing symptoms can mean your PV is changing.
I'll bet there's an expensive pharmaceutical treatment for this.
But it's just as vital to discuss changing symptoms as well.
Why do they not have it?
Take action. Discuss counts and symptoms.
I apologize for this. This is a new thing. I do not see closed captions on this. So you may watch this. I believe it's connected with a discussion question, and the captions might come up there. But you can watch the link. You can access the link from within the PDF. I don't know if this is captioned or not. I don't see an indication of that. So I'm not technically allowed to present this. So I'm going to end that. And we're going to go back to where we were. All right. So moving on. Marx is buried in London. He fled to London after the failed revolutions of 1848 because he was not a popular man in any European capital. He went to Paris, went to Brussels, and he was hounded, watched by the police, and everywhere he went, even in London, of course, he was watched by the police. But England was fairly open about accepting political exiles from the rest of Europe. He's buried in London. People still visit his grave. This is a very large, the Communist Party of Great Britain paid to erect this in the 1950s. It's been vandalized from time to time. Someone tried to set off a bomb there. It didn't do significant damage to the monument. Highgate Cemetery. I was there a couple of years ago, and it's quite a cemetery. It's about like you'd imagine a Gothic cemetery, a cemetery. Well, a Gothic cemetery. If you've seen ghost stories of some sort, horror stories, you may be familiar with what a Gothic environment might look like. But it's a very kind of creepy old cemetery in a sense. I mean, it's beautiful. Headstones are going every which way from the ground moving. Everything's overgrown. In the 1960s, a spiritualist in London made the claim that there were vampires in this cemetery, and many people believed him. A mob showed up at the gates of the cemetery with axes, knives, garlic, planning to go into the cemetery and deal with the vampires. They weren't allowed in, but over a period of the next few weeks, the caretakers began to find graves that had been disturbed, bodies of the deceased that had been beheaded and things like that. And eventually the spiritualist was convicted of trespassing and desecrating graves, and so that ended. But it is the sort of place you could believe there might be vampires or werewolves, so if you believed in such a thing. All right, so Marx is a big deal in sociology. If you go on to graduate school and you will have to take social theory, and you have to deal with Marx. You have to come to some sort of accommodation with him, either finding those parts of his ideas that you can accept and work with, if any, or stating your reasons for rejecting his ideas. You have to deal with him. someone you cannot get around. You can't get through graduate school without studying Marx. His ideas are kind of at the foundation of all sociological theory, in a sense. All of these other theories have developed as a reaction, a counter explanation to Marx. So his theory was a big picture theory at the macro level of analysis. Alienation is something he borrowed from Hegel. Now, this is different than psychological alienation. This is a kind of alienation that if you are a worker, a member of the proletariat in capitalist society, in other words, you do not own the means of production, the factory, the mine, whatever it happens to be where you work, but you sell your labor to them, you are alienated by definition for a number of reasons. One is that you don't have, your work tends to be controlled. The product you make does not belong to you. Marx believed that it was our nature as human beings, what he called our species being, to work, to create things. That is what we wanted to do. And when we are forced to create some specific thing by someone else that they are taking charge of, control over, and the process of our labor is controlled by them, we're not in charge, that's alienated from us. The thing we created has been alienated from us. It's taken and sold on a market. We're paid a wage. So for Marx, all workers under capitalism are alienated. They may not recognize this alienation. Here is another video. Now, this is part of a discussion question, so if you don't watch it there, you can watch it and comment on it. It's about a 2-minute animated video which explains this. So alienation was something he wrote very early, prior to the Communist Manifesto. His theory of alienation, his discussion of that, was published in 1932 in a collection called Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. Marx's writings can be divided into 2 eras, his younger, more humanist era and his later, more deterministic era, economistic. That's the era of Das Kapital, when it's argued that he was cynical about the possibility of humans actually changing society for the better. He tended to really take the human element of agency out of his theory of history. At least some claim that. I'm agnostic on the topic, so anyway. So the earlier stuff had a different tone than some of his later writings. Now, only 1 volume of Capital was published while Marx was alive. Friedrich Engels, his co-writer on many of his works, edited, compiled his notes. Marx was someone who was always getting sidetracked. He'd work on a problem, on part of something he was supposed to be writing, and he did work as a journalist for an American newspaper for some time until through the Civil War, but shortly after the Civil War, there was an economic downturn, and the newspaper he was writing freelance for could no longer pay him. So anyway, he would, this is going to sound familiar, he would get sidetracked quite easily. He would digress. He would come across a topic, a subject, and that he didn't know much about, and he would begin to study that, and he wouldn't return to the main argument he was on until he had fully mastered whatever this other topic was. So he wasn't a procrastinator because he kept writing about all these things everywhere. All of his digressions were documented. So Engels had a lot of notes and letters and other things to use to pull together a volume 2 and a volume 3 of Capital. There's another book called Theories of Surplus Value, his writings, that is sometimes considered volume 4 of Capital, but not always. The copy I have is just called Theories of Surplus Value. So they're very, in Capital itself, he wrote a lot about the conditions of the working class in England. Child labor was, discussed at length. Other aspects of the alienation of us from our species being our desire to creatively use our talents, our skills. So, okay, I said Marx was the first to bring social class into the explanatory structures of social theory. Marx believed what drove history forward, what was behind every major social transformation, was class struggle. The struggle between the class that owned what he called the means of production and the class that did not own it, that sold their labor. The former, the owners, he called the bourgeoisie, which is a French term. You've probably heard the term bourgeois, sometimes bougie or bougie, to refer to people in some suburbs of the area. I've heard it used that way by students. And the workers, also known as the proletariat, that comes from Latin. So owners and worker, bourgeoisie and proletariat, you could also say the capitalist class and the working class. And in his view, modern capitalism, which is I mentioned earlier on, it's a system based upon the control of economic production for profit by the owners of the means of production, where people sell their labor on a market. So, and I'm not going to go into exploitation and surplus value. If this were a class on social theory, I wouldn't even be as far as this yet. But again, if you were studying sociology as a major, you transfer somewhere, you'll take a sociological theory course that will get you into this much more deeply. If you go to graduate school, then you're going to spend a lot of time writing about all these things. So, ideology, I've already mentioned that, I believe, in our first lecture. So there are various takes on ideology. It could just be a set of beliefs. The way it's used by Marxists is often in the sense of false consciousness. These are beliefs that mystify the capitalist system. It prevents the workers from understanding what's actually going on. They don't recognize their true interests. They're acting in the interest of the capitalist class. That's false consciousness. Marx believed that class conflict could ramp up, and a revolution could be in the offing when the working class did finally recognize their own interests as different from those of the capitalist class. They developed class consciousness. They went from being a class in itself to being a class for itself. So you couldn't get to a real revolution without the development of class consciousness by a revolutionary agent of some sort, typically in capitalism that is identified as the working class. Ideology, though, in general, doesn't have to be false consciousness by any means. It's just a set of ideas that may or may not be true, but it kind of naturalizes the world. It makes things as they are seem normal. It's always been that way. That's how it works. Terry Eagleton, a Marxist literary critic, calls ideology a set of socially necessary illusions. They're illusions, but society would not function without them. All right, so Marx thought class conflict drives history, and part of the transformation involves contradictions. So Marx discusses contradictions at length. This goes back to Hegel, although Hegel didn't really use it in terms I'm about to give you. You have a contradiction between two forces. They both cannot coexist for long. There's something wrong. They're not, I don't want to say in harmony because that's too much like functionalism. But there's a clash, and the clash is resolved by creation of something new. Both systems, both entities that have clashed are transcended, and they're reformed in another way. The traces of them are left in the new society that's formed from the resolution of these contradictions. Marx and others call this the For instance, the existing state of affairs, the thesis, whatever that's developed that's new is the antithesis. You've heard that term before, antithesis. And what you get as a resolution is the synthesis, another term I know you've heard before. Hegel didn't use those terms, but he described the process. So Marx said specific, he took it down to the economic level. He said the transitions were from one social formation to another type of society were due to contradictions between the forces of production and the relations of production. The forces are the technology that's available in that society or social formation. The relations is this how people relate to one another, the class system for the most part, how rewards are distributed and how obligations are determined and so forth. The relations of production. Together, those two things together, you call a mode of production. I use the term social formation as something much broader than just simply these things. But these contradictions can develop. Basically, the forces of production are held back by the relations of production. An example would be, I was discussing feudalism and how these serfs were tied to the land. Now, by that I meant, I should have explained more, these serfs, they could not leave. They couldn't go to the cities. If they did and they were caught, they could be taken back to the manor that they worked for a lord and punished. They could be punished very severely because the lord of the manor was the judge and was in charge of the court for misdeeds, for judging misdeeds of everyone in his domain. So he didn't want to lose workers. Now, if you did get to the city and you could hide out for a year, it was generally understood that 1 year in the city freed you from your feudal obligations. So anyway, the Industrial Revolution is beginning. It's maybe just on the horizon, but people are trying to gather workers into larger manufacturing units of some sort, not necessarily industrial manufacturer, but just a new type of organization which requires more people working full time there. Now, if everyone's tied to the land or perfectly happy just being a peasant growing their food and being, their needs looked after as need be by the lord of the manor, you're not going to get many people. That is the contradiction between feudalism and the incipient capitalist system which was developing. So the forces of production were advancing as the Industrial Revolution was beginning. The relations of production were stuck. So there was a contradiction, and the feudal system fell, the capitalist system replaced it. That happened at different times in different parts of Europe. And again, let me remind you that I am basically paraphrasing Marx in all this. Historians would have a lot to, criticize and find a lot of problems, and have justifiably. So this is just a general schema, really. It's similar to what we're going to call an ideal type when we get to Max Weber. So anyway, so now Marx believed that capitalism would give way to socialism as a result of another contradiction between the forces of production. And in this case, that is because workers are not paid enough to purchase everything that's produced, because a portion of the value is taken from them by the capitalist, and that is where profit comes from. Marx, like all other economists of the time, believed in the labor theory of value. The value of a commodity was the labor that went into it, the amount of labor time that was required to produce it. That determined the value. That is generally believed to be mistaken. The labor theory of value has few adherents these days. You'll still find them among the Marxists that remain in economics, sociology, history, anthropology, some other fields. They will still refer to it. But Marx believed that capitalism was, by its nature, subject to periodic crises. Each crisis would be resolved in some way, typically by smaller, weaker corporate companies, industrial concerns being taken over by those that perhaps had more surplus cash and could weather the storm that would develop when they ended up with a situation where they're holding goods they cannot sell. They've overproduced. Workers have not been paid enough to buy all these things. Sometimes that's considered an underconsumption crisis or an overproduction. But, and I don't want to go into too much detail about the fixed and organic composition of capital, but that comes into it as well. Technology. Marx did not think technology added value to commodities. That's one of the key reasons that the labor theory of value is inadequate. It has no room for advanced technology. So anyway, so capitalism would fall. You move to another phase of social formation, social organization called socialism, where the state basically is running the economy. Private property still exists, but the the means of production is owned by the state, by the government. He felt that form of society, socialism, would give way to what he called communism. But basically, he wrote about capitalism. He did not write much about communism or about socialism, and even less about communism, except that he believed that the state, the government, would just disappear. There'd be no need for it. There would be no division of labor. His view of communism was of a utopia where one could do what one wanted to do, exercise one's creative potential. You did not have to work at any particular job. One of the key contradictions of capitalism for Marx and for many Marxists was that under the industrial system of production, and it is still true today, that it is possible to produce enough stuff to meet everybody's needs. Yet many people do not have what they need, all that they need. There's deprivation in the midst of the ability to end deprivation. So that is the key contradiction which will drive the demise of capitalism, the transformation into something else, socialism. But communism has never really been a communist state. Most of these states that were called communist were really state socialists in the sense where the state-owned organ controls the means of production. State-owned enterprises, they were called in China. China is now more capitalist than socialist or communist. A couple countries still call themselves communist. Even China, nominally, their ideology is Marxism, Leninism. Lenin was the leader of the Russian Revolution, which was the first communist, quote unquote, revolution in the world, 1917. Marxism, Leninism is the official dogma of most states that have become, all states, I think, that have embraced communism in name. I'm not sure that they ever operated in a way that Marx would have recognized as anything like what he had in mind. He once even told a group of French Marxists who had adopted his ideas, were followers of his. He attended one of their meetings and said that all he concluded from the meeting was that he was not a Marxist. So when Marx says he's not a Marxist, you can infer that his ideas were not being applied in the manner in which he intended them, or applied or understood in the way he thought they should be. So, Max Weber, he's associated with conflict theory, but with a lot more. He's also introduce concepts that are important to the symbolic interactionist. So he was from a fairly prosperous, politically connected family, so he observed at home as a young person political debates. He learned how power worked and didn't work right there at home, simply observing what went on around him. His father was a member of the German parliament, and powerful leaders would come by the house to discuss the issues of the day. He's best known, his most famous writing to most people is a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And to oversimplify, it's important. This was a reaction to Marx also, because Marx thought that economic interests were what the forces, the class conflict, contradictions between the forces and relations of production were what gave rise to capitalism. Weber showed the religious roots of the development of capitalism in ways that historians again quibble with, but Weber was he was mostly, it seems, trying to show that there were other things at play than simply economics in the development of capitalism. So he started from the observation that most of the most wealthiest business leaders and the leaders of the largest corporations in Europe were Protestants, whereas before the 16th century, everyone in Europe was a Catholic, Roman Catholic. It's something called the Reformation in the 16th century, which continued on through the 17th century in many ways, and we ended up, many people became Protestants, non-Catholics, so to speak, still Christians, but they adopted a different point of view. So he was curious why there was a relationship between religion and wealth and being the owner of a large capitalist enterprise. So I'm not going to go through that in any great length, but you may read through that in a moment. For now, let's just go through some of the concepts that he introduced to sociology, and he introduced a lot. You can't get around any field of sociology. Well, there's a few that he might not have had much of an impact on, but he is all over the place. So Verstehen, there's no good English translation for this. It means intuitive or empathic understanding. You're getting inside someone's head, so to speak, to try to understand how what they're doing vis-a-vis other people, social action, how they understand it, what they think they're doing, why they're doing it. You can't simply observe what happens. You can't simply observe and make notes and then do a statistical analysis of what you find. For him, that's nothing more than accounting. You don't learn anything about social action. You have to know what it means for people. Weber was also, oh, by the way, Marx considered himself a philosopher, an economist with economic interests. Weber was an economist. He also had a degree in law. He didn't consider himself a sociologist. Marx didn't consider himself one. So Weber studied a lot of economic aspects of social behavior, or should I say social aspects of economics. Either way, he wanted to develop a theory of history, world history, that was explanatory in nature. He was trying to, it's said that at his death in the early 20th century, he knew more about world history than anyone alive on the planet. And he was trying to tie it together with religion, with politics, organizations, everything. His key contributions are in the area of social stratification, understanding the class system, politics, and organizations. But this concept of Verstehen is something the symbolic interactionists said they could not work without that. Really. So how is Weber going to be able to create this theory of history, or at least just a treatment of history, cross-culturally, cross-temporally, and understand these social aspects of this? Well, he introduced the concept of an ideal type. It's not a definition, and most of his things that look like definitions are not. They're what he called ideal types. It's an ideal type is a cluster of features that something he's interested in has, in most cases, but not in all cases, that allow him to see that thing in different cultures and different periods of historical time. It's finding the most important elements of it, and it can, they can vary a little bit. Something can be considered a bureaucracy that doesn't have all the features of the ideal type of bureaucracy that we'll get to down the road. Social action is action that a person understands is related to one or more persons, other persons. It takes account of these other people. That's social action. The state, meaning, when I say that, I mean a government, typically the most powerful one, but it could be any of them. I mean, here in Houston, there are several levels of state power over us. Weber defined the state as an organization that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence in a given territorial area. What does that mean? That means they have the right to use violence against other people, and it's considered legitimate in that area. Now, right now, we're seeing a lot of protests over illegitimate use of violence by an agent of the state in Minneapolis. Minneapolis police officer. The police are agents of the state. In the case of that, in Minneapolis, the city government, that counts as a state. Their police are the only people who can legitimately use violence. That does not mean that all their use of violence is legitimate. And that doesn't mean that they're the only ones who are committing acts of violence, certainly. That just means that in many cases, it will be excused. Now, we know from history that almost invariably, if the person who is the victim of violence by a state actor is far less powerful than the dominant members of the dominant group in that society, in this case, African American, are less powerful than the white majority. If the victim is African American, then often it's almost automatically excused. The policeman's word is taken over that of any other. Now that so many people have cell phone cameras, people on the street can document what's going on themselves. The police have a problem with they often have body cameras now, but for some reason they are always malfunctioning when there's use of lethal force, when the police believe they are legitimately taking someone's life. So anyway, but if you think about it, okay, other levels of the state, the county sheriff, if the county sheriff pulls you over while you're driving and tells you to ask for your driver's license and you say no, and you continue to say no, he can use some sort, he can legitimately force you out of the car and take you to jail. That is violence. Maybe it doesn't leave a wound or a scar. That is still physical coercion. There are other circumstances where the violence can escalate. It often escalates if you are a person of color and in the wrong neighborhood and perhaps have a warrant out for your arrest, or you're driving a stolen car, something along those lines. So the county, also the state, we have the Department of Public Safety, the state troopers, the Texas Rangers. They're mostly there at their desks, but they're agents of the state carrying guns. And then at the federal level, you have the FBI, Homeland Security, the Drug Enforcement Administration, all those folks can use lethal force on you if it is justifiable and legitimate on the basis of decisions that are made by society in terms of what laws must be respected. Okay, so that's enough of that. Also, I mentioned Marx mentions, now let me be clear. Marx talked about two classes under capitalism, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. He knew there were other classes, but he thought these two are the ones that are going to be in conflict and drive society forward. For instance, there are merchants, people who just buy low and then buy something, tax something on, sell it to somebody else. That's not capitalism in his view. That's people have been merchants forever. Similarly, bankers, people who loan money. There have been money lenders around forever, for as long as there's been money. So they're not capitalists. And also, there's another group he called the lumpen proletariat, street people, criminals, and so forth. They were a sort of a class, but they've been around also for a long time. They weren't going to lead a revolution. Their conflict with the capitalist class was handled in petty ways, he would say, small scale. So, but Weber's class system was more complex. He had three dimensions to it. What are typically called class, status, and party. Class is economic class, similar to Marx, but is much more complex. He said that people of the same class have a shared economic situation. Status is something that's a cultural variable, really. It's related to your lifestyle and your cultural associations, your education, your religious affiliation, other groups, civil society groups you may belong to. Party or political power, it refers to where you are in the political order. Are you a member of the government? Are you an agent of the state? And so forth. This puts you in different shared situations. So you can analyze stratification, the layering of people, ranking of people on these three dimensions. Now, it was noticed pretty quickly that someone who ranks high, so to speak, meaning more of whatever it is, someone who is very wealthy and belongs to one of a handful of religions and has been to an elite college, often ranks high on this. People with political power on a first name basis. People who are high on one dimension tend to be high on the others. This is the Calvinism and capitalism argument. I'm going to leave you for that. You can go through that yourself. Ask me, and you can Google that and find a lot about it. He felt there was a master trend in history, something that you could see it happening for 1,500 years. It was going to continue into the future. Two things, there were two trends: rationalization and disenchantment. Rationalization refers to the process of a certain type of rationality, the spread of that process throughout social organizations across cultures. Rationalization primarily involves these 6 features. This is the ideal type of rationality, again, or rationalized social structures. This is very simple. If it looks familiar, you saw this, most of it, when I talked about McDonaldization. So, the definition from George Ritzer's book: rationalization is the process by which social structures are increasingly characterized by the most direct and efficient means to their ends. Means is the method you use, the mechanism for accomplishing something. The ends is your goal, what you want to do. And under rationalized systems, you can calculate, you can mathematically and rationally determine what means there are are the best ones to choose. At the same time, rationalization is occurring. The world is becoming disenchanted. These irrational aspects of decision making and of understanding the world are disappearing. So, for instance, an example: you lived in ancient Rome and you're thinking about starting a business of some sort. You just want to make perhaps a cafe. They wouldn't call it a cafe. You're just going to sell food. You don't know if this is a good idea or not. Now, in today's world, rationalized world, you might do a market analysis. You could hire consultants who could do some specific statistical analysis to determine maybe what part of the city you should try to locate your enterprise in, and the likelihood you're going to be successful, and you can calculate how much it's going to cost to get the supplies, the merchandise that you need, the ingredients for the things you're going to sell, to hire the workers, to rent the space, calculate all that. You can determine whether it's a good idea or not. In ancient Rome, you might have gone to see the guardian of the sacred chickens. People often went to see the guardian before him starting a business enterprise, a journey, starting a family, getting married. And the guardian basically just fed chickens. And you go see the guardian and ask if the chickens were eating that day. If the chickens were eating normally, then it was a good day for you to go forward with your enterprise. That was a good sign. If the chickens weren't eating, you probably should rethink it. Think about it and go back and see the guardian another day. I always thought I would have liked to have had that job. It sounded not bad. Be respected and important, and all you have to do is feed chickens and observe how greedily they're gobbling up the chicken feed. So, disenchantment, the elimination of mystery, emotion, magic. Weber he didn't think rationalization was a total positive. He thought we were losing a lot. Now, granted, a lot of what we were losing may have been, in the eyes of some people, pagan rituals, pagan beliefs that were better off gone, or irrational explanations for the movement of the planets and the development of thunderstorms. It wasn't Zeus throwing lightning bolts anymore. You didn't have a sacred spring where water nymphs had escaped Apollo, as you find at the city of Delphi in Greece. But anyway, so Weber was he suffered from depression. So he kind of was a pessimist. One of his ideal types we'll talk about, as I already alluded to, is bureaucracy, the way of organizing economic, political, educational activities. He felt that in the future we're going to be sort of trapped in an iron cage of bureaucracy, in a world that was just more or less lifeless in a certain sense. No more magic. And you may read this, please read this. This shows you simply how much of a downer Max could be. Max Weber, pardon me. I still sometimes, I should do better at German than I do. Occasionally I still slip and call him Weber, but in German the W's are pronounced like a V, Weber. So anyway, a lot of what Weber's view of the impact of bureaucratization, rationalization is similar to what Marx called alienation. A lot of people studied under Weber and followed adapted some of his ideas. I'm not sure why we have Harriet Martineau here. That probably should not be the case. That's the wrong time period. Her ideas were similar to Weber's. W.B. Du Bois, African-American, first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard. That's why I mentioned that. Part of his background, introduced the idea of double consciousness. We'll talk about that. I don't know why I have trouble putting the close quotes on there. I've seen this frequently now. Performed one of the first large-scale data investigations, statistical analyses of social life, Philadelphia in the United States. Some have said he's really the founder of American sociology, but because he worked in the Jim Crow era, and even though sociologists in some cases then considered themselves quite progressive, as did Harriet Martineau, despite what she had to say about First Peoples, aka Native Americans, on her trip to the United States. Sociologists left Du Bois out of the loop. He could not get a position anywhere but in historically black universities in the South, which is, he'd grown up in Massachusetts. He was exposed to racism in the South for the first time when he began teaching in Atlanta, I believe at Morehouse College. I'll check that and let you know if I was wrong. Not even sure Morehouse is in Atlanta, come to think of it. So anyway, Harriet Martineau, often called the first female sociologist. She's similar to Weber in that she thought it was important to study all aspects of social life to try to understand specific social problems. She had a social problems orientation. And it was interesting, she kind of also leaned towards what we're going to call functionalism, but she was an early feminist, and her analyses of marriage, family life, religion reflected that. Thorstein Veblen, he's famous for his idea of conspicuous consumption, which he introduced in a book called The Theory of the Leisure Class, about Gilded Age America, the period around 1880, let's say, in the United States, when there was a lot of wealth. People had become very wealthy investing in railroads and industry, iron and steel production, coal mining. This was the era of what were called the robber barons, who took advantage of a lot of government largesse to enrich themselves. This was, Americans had or a particular class of Americans had never been this wealthy. And he defined conspicuous consumption as buying something just to show people you can, something that costs a lot. You know, it's conspicuous. It's no good if people don't see that you have it. So it has to be showy. It has to be noticeable. You see this today. You often see this in someone who's come into a lot of money in the entertainment field. And Johnny Depp, for instance, was one. He spent money hand over fist on private islands and blasting Hunter S. Thompson's remains out of a cannon and multiple things. It's, at least according to his ex-wife, he went through money like water, and it was always something a little bit showy that other people had to know about. You've probably seen this in other realms. Buying, you know, someone might spend every cent they have on something they're going to wear to a party because they want to impress others and appear to be as well-to-do as this group, which can be useful socially. We'll get there eventually as well later. I'm taking a break now. In fact, I'm going to break this into two parts 1 and 2. So the YouTube rendering works a lot better that way. So I'm going to stop this and